The year 1876 had bled the heat of summer into the very bones of the Arizona Territory, and the nights offered little respite. The air that drifted through the open window of the last car of the westbound train was not cool but thick, carrying the scent of creosote, baked earth, and the distant, lonely bitterness of coal smoke. It was an air that promised nothing but more of the same, more dust, more heat, more unforgiving distance. This was a land that did not nurture, it endured, and it demanded the same of everything that moved across its face. The train itself was a creature of this land, a groaning, sighing beast of iron and steam. It did not glide through the darkness but fought its way, each turn of its massive wheels a percussive scream of metal on metal, a rhythmic, relentless count of the miles being put between one place and another. For the young woman who slipped through the carriage door like a shadow, that sound was the only prayer she had left. Her name was Mira. It was a name that felt foreign on her own tongue now, a relic from a life that had been stripped away piece by painful piece. She carried nothing but the clothes on her back, a calico dress the color of a faded sky, worn thin at the elbows and frayed at the hem. Dust clung to it, not as a temporary coating, but as if it had become part of the fabric itself. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was a tangled mess escaping a hastily tied knot at the nape of her neck, loose strands clinging to her damp skin. She was exhausted, a weariness so profound it had settled deep in her marrow, making each step a conscious effort of will. But beneath the exhaustion, a sharper, more urgent feeling pulsed fear. It was a living thing, a cold serpent coiled in her belly, and its presence was in her eyes, in the constant furtive glances she cast over her shoulder, back toward the receding lights of the last depot, back toward the endless, swallowing darkness of the plains. She had waited in the suffocating shadows of the water tower for what felt like an eternity, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, until the train gave its final, shuddering hiss of steam. She'd watched the few other passengers board a family with 2 weary children, a salesman with a slicked-down mustache and a sample case, a trio of boisterous men whose laughter was too loud for the quiet desperation of the night. She had let them all pass, pressing herself deeper into the darkness, making herself smaller, less visible. Only when the final call of all aboard had echoed and the conductor had swung himself up did she move, a fleeting wraith darting from the shadows and pulling herself onto the steps of the very last car. The car was nearly empty, a long, hollow tube lit by a single, swaying oil lamp that cast long, dancing shadows. The plush velvet seats were worn and split in places, leaking horsehair stuffing like dried wounds. The air was stale with the ghosts of 1,000 journeys, of cheap cigar smoke and unwashed bodies, and the faint, sweet smell of decay. Mira paused just inside the door, her hand still on the cold brass handle, letting her eyes adjust to the gloom. Her gaze swept the length of the car, past the empty seats, past the grimy windows that reflected only her own haunted face against the passing blackness. And then she saw him. He was at the far end of the car, in the very last seat, a space that seemed more a part of the shadows than the carriage itself. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, his form made immense by the long, canvas duster he wore. The coat was the color of the earth, stained with the alkali dust and sweat of 1,000 miles, a second skin that spoke of long days in the saddle and longer nights under the stars. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, obscuring his face in shadow, but she could see the hard line of his jaw, stubbled and uncompromising. He wasn't sleeping. He was simply sitting, perfectly still, one hand resting on his knee, the other out of sight. He seemed not so much a passenger on the train as a piece of the landscape it was passing through, as rugged, as silent, and as unyielding as the distant mesas sketched against the star-dusted horizon. For a long moment, Mira didn't move. She just watched him, her breath held tight in her chest. Every instinct, honed by weeks of running and hiding, screamed at her to retreat, to find an empty corner and curl into a ball until the sun came up. Men were the source of her trouble, the reason she was on this train with nothing but a heart full of terror. They were the loud laughter, the grasping hands, the cruel promises. But this man was different. He was quiet. The profound stillness that surrounded him was not the coiled silence of a predator waiting to strike, but the deep, settled quiet of a mountain. He seemed entirely self-contained, a world unto himself, indifferent to the rattling train, to the oppressive night, to her, and in his indifference, Mira sensed a strange kind of safety. He didn't want anything. He didn't look at her with hunger or calculation. He didn't look at her at all. He simply existed, a bulwark of shadow at the end of the world. Her legs, trembling with a combination of fear and fatigue, began to move of their own accord. She walked the length of the aisle, her worn boots making no sound on the dusty floorboards. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels seemed to grow louder, counting down her steps. Clack, 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 a heartbeat. Clack, 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 a judgment. With each step, she felt more exposed, more vulnerable, certain that at any moment he would look up, his eyes pinning her in the dim light, demanding to know who she was and what she wanted. But he didn't move, not so much as a flicker of an eyelash. It was as if he were carved from stone. She stopped beside his seat, her small frame looking impossibly fragile next to his solid mass. She could smell the faint, clean scent of saddle leather and dust and something else, something uniquely masculine and earthy, like the smell of rain on dry ground, for a full minute. She stood there, the words she needed to say caught in her throat, a knot of desperation and shame. She was asking for something impossible, something a decent woman would never ask of a stranger. But decency was a luxury she had lost long ago. All she had left was the raw, primal need to survive, to be invisible, to disappear. Finally, she leaned forward, her voice so soft it was barely more than a breath of air, lost in the noise of the train. "Sir," he gave no sign that he had heard. She swallowed, the sound loud in her own ears, and tried again, forcing the words past her dry lips. They came out as a ragged whisper. Could I sit under your coat?" The request hung in the air between them, absurd and deeply intimate. It was the plea of a child, a desperate prayer to a silent God. She expected him to laugh, to push her away, to turn a cold, questioning eye on her. She expected anger or suspicion or, worst of all, a leering kind of interest. She braced herself for it, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides, her shoulders hunched in anticipation of a blow, verbal or otherwise. Reed Thorne did none of those things. For a long, stretched moment, he remained perfectly still. Then, in a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to take an eternity, he lifted his arm. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak. He simply took the edge of his heavy duster and pulled it open, creating a dark, sheltered space between his body and the worn wall of the train car. It was not an invitation, not a gesture of welcome. It was a simple, factual response to a desperate question. A space had been requested. A space had been provided. Tears of raw, unadulterated relief pricked the back of Mira's eyes, so sharp and sudden they made her gasp. She didn't let them fall. She didn't have time for tears. Without a second's hesitation, she slid into the narrow gap, tucking her legs beneath her and pressing her back against the vibrating wall. The heavy canvas of the coat fell around her, a curtain dropping on the world. The darkness was immediate and absolute. It smelled of dust and leather and the faint, not unpleasant scent of the man himself. The cavernous, swaying train car disappeared, replaced by this small, confined sanctuary. The world shrank to the space she occupied, a pocket of quiet stillness in the heart of the roaring machine. The oppressive air of the carriage was replaced by a surprising warmth radiating from the solid wall of his body beside her. He was a furnace of slow, steady heat. She huddled there, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible, terrified of brushing against him too much, of trespassing on this silent, unimaginable charity. The fabric of his shirt was coarse against her cheek, the heavy canvas of the duster a comforting weight over her. The cacophony of the train was muffled now. The sharp, metallic screeching softened into a dull, rhythmic rumble. Beneath that rumble, she could feel another rhythm, a deep, slow, steady beat. It was his breathing, the rise and fall of his chest, in and out. A living metronome that was so much more calming than the frantic, panicked fluttering in her own chest. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the ever-present image of the faces she was fleeing began to recede. The constant, gnawing fear in her gut did not disappear, but it loosened its hold, its sharp teeth retracting just enough for her to take a full, deep breath. The air she drew in was his air, the air of this small, dark space he had granted her. It was the breath of a stranger, a silent, stony man who had offered her refuge without a single word. And as the train plunged deeper into the vast, indifferent wilderness of the Arizona night, Mira's own ragged breathing began to slow, to unconsciously match the steady, quiet rhythm of the man beside her, her small, exhausted heartbeat finding a temporary peace in the shelter of his silence. Time ceased to have meaning in the warm, rhythmic darkness beneath the cowboy's coat. Minutes blurred into an hour, then perhaps longer. Mira drifted in a state between waking and sleeping, a fragile peace she hadn't known was possible. The constant, grinding tension that had been her companion for so many weeks eased its grip, coil by painful coil, here, curled into the smallest possible version of herself. She was not a name, not a face, not a possession to be reclaimed. She was nothing but a faint warmth, a quiet breath, shielded from the world by a wall of silent canvas and the unyielding presence of the man beside her. His stillness was a language of its own, a steady declaration that this small piece of territory was claimed and held. The train rattled on, its monotonous song a lullaby of escape. Each clatter of the wheels on the track was another mile, another irreversible measure of distance from the life she had fled. The man, Reed Thorne, did not shift. He did not cough or fidget. He was as constant as the northern star, his breathing a slow, deep tide that Mira found herself anchoring to. It was a strange and profound intimacy, to be so close to a stranger, to share his warmth and the very air he breathed, all without a single word exchanged. She knew nothing of him, not his name, not his destination, not the nature of the thoughts that might be moving behind his stony silence. Yet, in this moment, he was the most solid thing in her universe. He was safety. Her exhausted mind began to drift. Pulling her back into fragmented memories she fought to suppress. The stale smell of whiskey and cheap perfume in the saloon, the jangling discord of an out-of-tune piano, the grating sound of a man's laughter, a sound that always held a note of ownership, of cruel amusement. She remembered the weight of his hand on her arm, not gentle but proprietary, a brand that marked her as his. His name was Silas Croft, and the memory of his face, with its small, calculating eyes and a mouth that was always twisted in a sneer or a false smile, sent a fresh tremor of fear through her. He was not a man who forgave debts, and he considered her the final payment on her father's unfortunate ledger. He was not a man who accepted defiance. Her running away was not just an escape, it was an insult to his pride, an act of theft he would see rectified. He had told her as much, his voice a low promise of consequence that chilled her to the bone. "There ain't no corner of this earth you can run to where I won't find you," he had promised. A sudden change in the train's rhythm jolted her from the memory. The rhythmic clatter slowed, the engine letting out a long, mournful sigh of steam. The brakes groaned in protest. A stop. Her heart, which had finally found a calmer beat, leaped back into a frantic, panic tattoo against her ribs. They couldn't be stopping. Not yet. It was too soon. Every stop was a risk, a new chance for the world to find its way in, for her past to catch up to her present. She pressed herself tighter against the wall, pulling her knees closer to her chest, instinctively trying to vanish. Beside her, she felt the man shift, a subtle change in the tension of his muscles. It wasn't a large movement, just a slight repositioning, but it was enough to tell her that he was alert, his senses attuned to the change. He was listening, watching. The train shuddered to a halt, the sudden silence deafening after the constant motion. Muffled sounds from outside filtered into the car, the crunch of boots on gravel. A man's voice calling out, indistinct and unimportant. Then came a sound that made the blood freeze in Mira's veins, the heavy slam of the carriage door at the far end of the car, followed by the sound of multiple sets of heavy, purposeful footsteps. It wasn't the sound of a boarding passenger. It was the sound of a search. Mira went rigid, every muscle in her body locking in place. She stopped breathing. The serpent of fear in her belly, which had been sleeping, awoke and coiled viciously, its icy venom flooding her system. It was them. It had to be them. Silas was a man of means and many unsavory connections. He would have sent men. He would have sent them with descriptions, with money, with promises of a reward for his returned property. The footsteps advanced down the aisle, slow and deliberate. There were 3 of them. She could distinguish the different cadences of their gaits. One was heavy, a flat-footed stomp. Another was lighter, quicker. The third was uneven, a slight drag in the step. With each step that brought them closer, Mira's world shrank further, until it was nothing but the roaring of blood in her ears and the suffocating darkness under the coat. This was it. This was where her desperate flight for freedom came to an ignominious end. She felt a desperate, primal urge to bolt, to burst from her hiding place and run, but she was paralyzed. There was nowhere to go. She was trapped in a metal box with the very monsters she had been running from. Her breath was trapped in her lungs, a painful, burning pressure. Her mind screamed. Just as a sob of pure terror threatened to tear its way from her throat, she felt a subtle pressure against her shoulder. It was the man's arm, moving with an almost imperceptible slowness. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't turn to look down at her. His gaze, she knew without seeing, remained fixed forward, with a quiet, rustling sound. He adjusted the heavy duster, pulling the canvas flap more securely over her, tucking it in slightly against the seat. It was a small, simple gesture, but it was a clear and unmistakable message. Stay still. Stay silent. I have this. The footsteps stopped just a few rows away. A coarse voice cut through the silence. Check under the seats. Jeb, Silas said she's a slip of a thing. Could be hiding anywhere. Ain't nobody in here but that one fella. Another voice, higher and thinner, replied, Place is empty. Don't matter. Look anyway, the first voice commanded. Mira heard the scrape and thump of the men checking the nearby seats, their grunts of effort punctuating the tense silence. She squeezed her eyes shut so tightly she saw bursts of light against the blackness. Her entire being was focused on being small, on being quiet, on ceasing to exist. The material of the man's shirt was damp where her cheek was pressed against it, though whether from her sweat or his, she couldn't tell. The heavy, flat-footed steps approached their row. They stopped directly beside them. Mira could smell them, a sour stench of sweat, cheap whiskey, and unwashed wool. It was a smell she associated with fear and powerlessness. What about him? The thin voice asked, clearly referring to Reed. Hey, mister, the coarse voice barked. Much closer now. The sound vibrated through the floor, through the seat, and into Mira's bones. We're looking for someone. A girl. You seen a girl on this train, dark hair, scared rabbit eyes? There was a long, ringing silence. Mira held her breath, convinced her pounding heart must be as loud as a blacksmith's hammer. She waited for the cowboy to answer, to deny seeing her, to feign ignorance. He did not speak. He simply sat there, a mountain of silence. His lack of response was more powerful, more unnerving, than any denial could have been. It was a silent challenge, a refusal to even acknowledge their question, their authority, their very existence. "He deaf or something?" The third man, the one with the dragging foot, grumbled. "I ain't deaf," Reed Thorne said. His voice, when it finally came, was deeper than Mira could have imagined. It was not loud, but it filled the entire car, a low rumble like stones grinding together deep in the earth. It was a voice devoid of warmth, of fear, of any emotion at all. It was the voice of pure, cold fact. The first man was clearly taken aback by the tone. His own voice held a new note of blustering uncertainty. "Well, then, did you see the girl or not? There's a reward." Another silence stretched, taut and humming with unspoken threat. Mira could picture the scene in her mind, the three men, posturing and aggressive, facing the single seated figure. They were used to inspiring fear, to getting what they wanted through intimidation, but they had just run up against something they did not understand. They had run up against a man who did not intimidate. From her hiding place, Mira felt, rather than saw, him finally move his head. It was a slow, deliberate turn. He was looking at them. "You have business with me?" he asked, his voice still that same impossibly calm, impossibly cold rumble. He wasn't answering their question. He was asking his own, turning the interrogation back on them. "Our business is finding that girl," the leader snapped, trying to regain control. "Then your business is not with me," Reed stated. It was not a suggestion or a request for them to leave. It was a final, unarguable declaration, a closing of a door. "Move along." Mira could feel the shift in the air, the prickling tension as the three men processed this dismissal. It was a direct challenge to their dominance. Their pride was on the line. She heard a soft scuff of a boot, a shifting of weight. One of them was preparing for trouble. She risked opening her eyes just a crack, peering through a tiny gap in the canvas. All she could see was a sliver of the aisle and the dirty floor. A pair of scuffed, worn boots stood there, belonging to the man closest to them. "Now you listen here," the man began, his voice rising in anger. "I don't take kindly to being told what to do." He never finished the sentence. She heard a sound, a soft, slick whisper of leather on metal, followed by a quiet, metallic click. It was not a loud sound, but it sliced through the tension in the car with the finality of a guillotine. It was the sound of a pistol's hammer being cocked. The silence that followed was absolute. "I believe," Reed Thorne said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming something truly dangerous, a gravelly whisper that promised nothing but consequence, "that I told you to move along." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet, deadly click had said everything that needed to be said. Mira could feel the change in the men's posture without even seeing it. The aggression evaporated, replaced by a sudden, stark understanding of their situation. They had prodded something they should have left alone. For another long, stretched-out second, nobody moved. Then, the scuffed boots in Mira's narrow field of vision took a clumsy step backward. "No trouble here, mister," the leader said, his voice suddenly placating. "All the earlier bravado gone? Just asking. No trouble." The boots shuffled back further. She heard the other men backing away as well, their movements clumsy and rushed in the narrow aisle. They retreated down the length of the car, their footsteps now hurried and lacking all their earlier confidence. The carriage door at the far end opened and slammed shut with a bang that echoed in the sudden emptiness. A moment later, the train gave a lurch, then another, and began to slowly, painstakingly, pull away from the stop. The rhythmic, life-affirming clatter of the wheels resumed, growing steadily faster, steadily louder, carrying them away, carrying them back into the safety of motion and darkness. Beneath the coat, Mira remained frozen, every nerve in her body screaming. The danger had passed, but the terror was still a physical presence inside her. It took another full minute before she could convince her lungs to work again. She let out a breath she hadn't even been aware she was holding, a long, shaky, silent exhalation that felt like it was draining the very last of her strength. It was a release so profound, so complete, that it left her feeling hollowed out, weak as a newborn kitten. The man beside her did not speak. She heard another soft click as he presumably uncocked the pistol, a sound of settled violence. He did not ask her if those men were the ones she was running from. He did not ask for an explanation. He did not acknowledge the life-or-death drama that had just unfolded in the space of a few heartbeats. He simply sat there, his arm a solid, reassuring pressure against her shoulder, the duster a dark, impenetrable shield. The train picked up speed, plunging once more into the vast, empty night. And for the first time in so many days, Mira felt the tight, cold knot of fear in her chest truly, finally, begin to dissolve. She had not been found. She was not being dragged back to Silas. She was still moving forward, and she was not, as she had been for so long, entirely alone. The rest of the train ride passed in a state of suspended reality. Mira remained in her sanctuary, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a constant, hypnotic sound that kept the recent terror at bay. The men did not return. No one else boarded or bothered them. The silent cowboy, Reed Thorne, remained an unmoving sentinel beside her. He had offered no words of comfort or explanation after the incident, and she had expected none. His actions had spoken with a clarity that words could never match. He had shielded her, defended her, and then returned to his profound stillness, as if confronting armed men were a common, unremarkable occurrence. This silent, absolute competence was more reassuring than any empty platitude could ever be. For the first time, a fragile seed of trust began to sprout in the barren soil of her fear. Hours later, in the deep, star-dusted velvet of the pre-dawn sky, she felt a subtle shift. The train was slowing again, but this time it was different. There was no hiss of brakes signaling a station, no gradual deceleration for a water stop. It was a slight, almost imperceptible reduction in speed as the train labored up a long, steady grade. A hand rested lightly on her shoulder. Mira flinched, her body still wired for danger, but the touch was impossibly gentle, a stark contrast to the man's rugged exterior. It wasn't a grab or a shake, just a firm, steady pressure. She looked up, though in the pitch darkness under the coat, she could see nothing but a deeper shade of black. "We're getting off," his voice rumbled. So low, it was more a vibration she felt through his chest than a sound she heard with her ears. Fear, cold and familiar, tried to reclaim her. Getting off here. In the middle of nowhere, the train was safety, its constant motion a promise of distance. To leave it was to be stationary, to be vulnerable, a target in the vast, empty wilderness. Her breath hitched, as if sensing her panic. His hand remained on her shoulder, a grounding weight. "It's not safe to ride it all the way to a town," he explained, his voice still that same low, factual monotone. "They'll be watching the depots. Telegraphs move faster than trains." His logic was cold, sharp, and undeniable. Of course, Silas would have sent word ahead. Men would be waiting at every stop, scanning the faces of every disembarking passenger. To arrive in a town was to walk directly into a cage. This man, this stranger, had not only saved her from the immediate threat, but was thinking steps ahead, navigating the geography of her escape with a strategist's mind. She had been thinking only of running. He was thinking of how to run successfully. "Now," he said, and the pressure on her shoulder lifted. She understood, without a word. She unfolded her stiff limbs, crawling out from under the heavy duster. The air of the carriage felt cold and thin against her skin after the shared warmth of her hiding place. In the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy window, she could finally see his face more clearly. His hat was still pulled low, but the shadows were less absolute. He had a strong, square jaw, a straight nose, and a mouth that was set in a firm, unsmiling line. His eyes, fixed on the landscape outside, were what held her. They were the color of a winter sky, a pale, clear gray that seemed to absorb the light and give nothing back. They were the eyes of a man who saw everything and revealed nothing. He rose to his feet in one fluid motion, his tall frame nearly brushing the curved ceiling of the car. He moved to the carriage door, not the one at the end of the aisle, but a side door used for freight. He worked the heavy latch with a practiced silence, easing it open just enough to slip through. He glanced back at her, a single, sharp look that was not a question but a command. Follow. Mira hesitated for only a heartbeat. Every instinct she had once possessed would have screamed at her not to follow a strange man out of a moving train and into the heart of the desert night. But her old instincts belonged to a world that no longer existed. Her new reality was the one that had been forged in the last several hours. This man was the difference between capture and freedom, between terror and a fragile chance at peace. She took a breath and followed him. The wind hit her with a physical force, whipping her hair across her face and stealing the air from her lungs. It was a dry, scouring wind, carrying sand that stung her cheeks. The train was moving faster than she'd realized, the ground a rushing blur of gray rock and skeletal brush in the moonlight. Reed was already on the narrow iron step, braced against the side of the car, one hand holding the rail. He reached back for her, his large, calloused hand engulfing hers. His grip was firm, impersonal, and utterly secure. "On my count," he shouted over the roar of the wheels and the wind. "Tuck and roll!" He pointed to a place ahead where the steep embankment softened into a sandy wash. She nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the train's steady rhythm. 3, he said, his grip tightening. 2, 1, now! He jumped, pulling her with him. For a terrifying second, she was airborne, suspended between the roaring iron beast and the hard, unyielding earth. Then they hit the sand, and his instruction made sense. He absorbed the impact, turning their momentum into a controlled roll down the soft, sloping bank. Mira, clumsy and unprepared, tumbled after him, her limbs flailing. She came to a stop in a heap at the bottom of the wash, the world a dizzying, spinning chaos. Sand was in her hair, her mouth, her eyes. She lay there, gasping for breath, the silence of the desert pressing in on her as the train's roar receded into the distance, its red tail light shrinking until it was just another star that winked out and disappeared. And then there was only the sound of the wind, a lonely, mournful sigh sweeping across the endless expanse of rock and sand. Reed was already on his feet, brushing sand from his duster as if he'd just stepped off a porch. He looked down at her, a dark, towering silhouette against the star-dusted sky. "You hurt?" he asked. Mira did a quick, internal inventory. She was bruised, scraped, and dizzy, but nothing was broken. She shook her head, pushing herself into a sitting position. "No, I'm all right." He gave a single, sharp nod. The matter settled. He scanned the surrounding landscape, his gaze sweeping across the dark, hulking shapes of the mesas and the jagged lines of the distant mountains. He was reading the land, she realized, the way another man might read a map. After a moment, he pointed toward a dark cleft in a nearby rock formation. "We'll make camp there, out of the wind." He offered her a hand to help her up. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet with an easy strength that seemed to require no effort at all. They began to walk, their footsteps silenced by the deep sand of the wash. The desert at night was not empty. Mira discovered. It was alive with 1,000 tiny sounds, the skittering of unseen creatures, the rustle of dry leaves on a hardy bush, the whisper of the wind as it carved new shapes into the ancient stone. But it was a wild, untamed life, utterly indifferent to human concerns. It was a place where a person could disappear completely. The spot Reed had chosen was a natural shelter, a wide, sandy hollow protected on 3 sides by a towering outcrop of red rock that had been sculpted by centuries of wind and water. It was a small pocket of stillness in the vast, windswept landscape. Without a word, he shrugged off the small pack he'd been wearing, which she hadn't even noticed until now. From it, he produced a bedroll, a canteen, and a small, canvas-wrapped parcel. The economy of his possessions spoke of a life lived on the move, a life stripped down to the bare essentials of survival. He handed her the canteen. "Drink." She did, the water tasting of metal and dust, but more welcome than any wine. While she drank, he set about gathering firewood. He didn't search for large branches, but moved with a quiet efficiency, collecting dry, brittle sagebrush and the skeletal remains of cholla cacti, breaking them into manageable pieces with his bare hands. He built a small, tight ring of stones and laid the wood inside with a practiced, almost artistic precision. He then took out a small flint and steel. "You know how to make a fire?" Mira nodded. It was one of the few practical skills she possessed from her former life, a chore she had performed daily. She took the flint and steel from him, their fingers brushing for a brief second. His skin was rough, calloused, the skin of a man who worked with his hands. She knelt by the fire pit, striking the flint against the steel, sending a shower of sparks into the tinder-dry sage. On the third try, a tiny spark caught, glowing like a captured ember. She blew on it gently, coaxing it, nurturing it, until a small, hungry flame flickered to life. As the fire grew, pushing back the oppressive darkness and the biting chill of the desert night, she watched him. He had settled back against the rock wall, his long legs stretched out before him. He had taken off his hat, and in the flickering firelight, she saw him fully for the first time. His hair was dark brown, thick and unruly, and cut short in a practical, no-nonsense way. There were lines etched at the corners of his eyes and around his mouth, lines carved not by age but by sun and wind and hard living. It was not a handsome face in the classical sense. It was too rugged, too severe, but it was a strong face, a face that had looked into the abyss and had not flinched. He reached into the canvas parcel and pulled out 2 long strips of jerky and a hard, dry biscuit. He broke the biscuit in half and handed 1/2 and a strip of the dried meat to her. "It's all I've got," he said, not as an apology, but as a simple statement of fact. She took it, her stomach twisting with a hunger she hadn't realized was so profound. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind outside their rocky alcove. The jerky was tough, salty, and smoky, and it took a long time to chew. But it was the most satisfying meal she had ever eaten. It was food for survival, honest and unpretentious, and she was grateful for it. He ate slowly, methodically, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. He did not look at her. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she was from or what she was running from. He did not ask about the men on the train or the fear that he must have seen in her eyes. His silence was a gift, a vast, open space in which she did not have to explain, justify, or defend herself. He seemed to accept her presence as a simple fact, like the rocks and the fire and the stars overhead. She was here. That was all that mattered. As Mira chewed on the last of her jerky, she watched the firelight play across his face, casting shifting shadows that made his rugged features seem even more pronounced. The flames danced in his pale eyes, and for the first time, she saw the light of a fire reflected in the eyes of a man who clearly wanted nothing from her. Not her body, not her labor, not her gratitude. He had acted, and was acting still, out of some silent, internal code that she could not begin to fathom. He had offered her shelter, protection, and the last of his food, and he had asked for nothing in return. In the world she had come from, every action was a transaction, every kindness a down payment on a future debt. Men gave things to get things. They offered a smile in exchange for a favor, a compliment in exchange for compliance. Silas had been a master of this cruel arithmetic. His generosity always a preface to a demand. His protection always a chain. To be in the presence of a man whose actions seemed entirely free of such calculations was a revelation. It was like breathing clean air after a lifetime in a smoke-filled room. The fire crackled, sending a shower of orange sparks up into the infinite darkness. The small circle of light and warmth felt like the only sane and solid place in the entire universe. She, a runaway with nothing to her name, and he, a silent cowboy with nothing but his horse and the contents of a small pack, were sharing this space, this moment, this profound and uncomplicated silence. She didn't know his name, though she had heard it spoken once. Reed, it suited him. It was a hard, solid, one-syllable name, like a stone, and she had not offered hers. To say her name was to give a piece of herself away, to offer up a thread that could be used to pull her back into the world she was trying to escape. Here, in the anonymity of the desert, they were just two people, a man and a woman, huddled around a fire, temporary allies against the vast, indifferent darkness. And for now, that was more than enough. They traveled for 2 more days. The journey unfolded in the same profound silence that had first defined their acquaintance. Reed led the way with an unerring sense of direction, navigating the featureless plains and winding through labyrinthine canyons as if following an invisible map etched onto the landscape itself. He had retrieved a horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding, from a hidden ravine where it had been patiently waiting, hobbled and well supplied with a small cache of water and oats. He named the horse Solomon, and the animal seemed to possess the same quiet, enduring spirit as its master. For much of the journey, Mira rode behind him, her arms loosely around his waist, her cheek resting against the solid expanse of his back. The rhythmic sway of the horse was a comforting, hypnotic motion. At other times, when the terrain was flat and the pace was slow, she would walk alongside him, her worn boots sinking into the dust, to give the horse a rest and to ease the stiffness in her own limbs. During these long, sun-drenched hours, the silence between them was not empty or awkward. It was a shared space, filled with the sounds of the wilderness, the cry of a hawk circling high overhead, the steady plod of Solomon's hooves, the whisper of the wind through the sparse, hardy grass. Reed did not press her with questions, and she did not offer information. Her past remained a locked room, and he did not jiggle the handle. He simply existed beside her, a constant, reassuring presence. He taught her, through quiet gestures, how to find water by looking for cottonwood trees, how to read the position of the sun to tell the time, how to walk so as to leave the least possible sign of her passing. These were not lessons given with words, but with a pointed finger, a shared glance, a patient demonstration. He was teaching her the language of survival, the grammar of his world. Late on the 3rd day, just as the sun began to bleed orange and purple along the western horizon, they crested a low rise. Below them, nestled in a gentle fold of the hills, was a sight so unexpected it made Mira catch her breath. It was a ranch, not a grand, sprawling operation, but a small, humble homestead that seemed to have grown organically from the land itself. A simple cabin, built of sturdy, sun-bleached logs chinked with clay, sat at the center. Its roof was made of sod, and a thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a fragile gray ribbon against the vibrant sky. A split-rail corral stood nearby, enclosing 3 horses that raised their heads to watch their approach. There was a small, well-tended vegetable garden, a chicken coop, and a barn that looked older than the cabin, its wood weathered to a silvery gray. The entire place was cradled by a crescent of low, rolling hills, protecting it from the harsh winds of the open plains. It was a place of profound peace, an island of quiet domesticity in the vast, untamed wilderness. "This is it," Reed said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first time he had spoken in hours. As they drew closer, the cabin door opened and a small figure emerged. It was a boy, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, with a shock of unruly blonde hair and wide, curious blue eyes. He was dressed in a simple homespun shirt and patched trousers, his feet bare and dusty. He stood on the porch, watching them, his expression one of sober appraisal rather than childish excitement. When his eyes met Reed's, a slow, radiant smile spread across his face, a smile of pure, unadulterated welcome. He raised a hand in a small, silent wave. Reed dismounted in one fluid motion and reached up to help Mira down. Her legs felt unsteady after so long on horseback. The boy ran to meet them, not with a shout, but with a quick, light-footed eagerness. He threw his arms around Reed's waist in a fierce hug, burying his face in the dusty duster. Reed's hand came to rest on the boy's head, a gesture of immense, quiet affection. "This is Finn," Reed said to Mira, his hand still on the boy's hair. Then he looked down at the boy. "Finn, this is a friend. She'll be staying with us for a while." He did not use her name because he did not know it. Finn looked up at Mira, his blue eyes clear and intelligent. He studied her face for a long moment, taking in her worn dress, her tired eyes, and the lingering fear that still clung to her like a second skin. He did not smile at her, but his expression held no suspicion, only a deep, unnerving seriousness. Then he raised his hand again and made a series of quick, intricate gestures. Reed watched the boy's hands. "He says you look tired," he translated, his voice flat. "He says you're welcome here." Mira was so taken aback she could only stare. "He doesn't speak," she whispered. Reed shook his head, his gaze still on the boy. "He hasn't spoken a word since I found him. Some folks are just made for the quiet." The words were simple, but they held a universe of understanding and acceptance. He wasn't broken. He was just quiet, like Reed himself. That first evening, a new routine began to form, a silent dance of domesticity. Finn, with a solemnity that was both charming and heartbreaking, took it upon himself to be Mira's guide. He showed her the water pump, the outhouse, and the small room in the cabin that would be hers. It was a tiny, Spartan space, containing only a narrow cot with a clean, patched quilt, a small wooden crate for a table, and a single window that looked out onto the rolling hills. But it was clean, it was safe, and it was hers. It was the first room she had had to herself in over a year. She began to work, not because anyone asked her to, but because the stillness was a void she needed to fill. To be idle was to let the memories in, to let the fear fester. To work was to focus on the present, on the simple, tangible reality of the task at hand. She took the broom from its hook by the door and began to sweep the porch, her movements stiff and awkward at first, then smoother and more rhythmic. The simple act of clearing away the dust and leaves was deeply satisfying, a small act of imposing order on a chaotic world. Reed did not thank her or praise her. He simply accepted her contribution as a natural part of the day's rhythm. While she swept, he and Finn tended to the horses, their movements synchronized in a long-practiced harmony. There were no spoken commands. A glance, a nod, a subtle gesture was all that passed between them. Yet they worked with a seamless efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. Later, she moved into the cabin's main room, which served as a kitchen, dining area, and living space. It was as simple and unadorned as the rest of the ranch, but it was immaculately clean. A rough-hewn wooden table and 2 benches stood in the center. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a cast-iron stew pot hanging from a hook within it. Shelves held a modest collection of tin plates, wooden cups, and basic provisions: flour, beans, salt. Finn showed her where everything was, pointing with a small, dusty finger, his eyes watching her face to make sure she understood. She found potatoes and onions in a root cellar beneath the floorboards and soon had a simple stew simmering over the fire, the savory aroma filling the small cabin. As she stirred the pot, She felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in a very long time. This was not the coerced servitude of Silas Croft's saloon, where every meal she cooked was a payment on a debt she could never repay. This was different. This was a contribution. It was an act of creation, a way of offering something of herself to this quiet, unassuming sanctuary. They ate their meal in the flickering firelight, the three of them seated at the long table. The silence persisted, but it was a comfortable, companionable silence, punctuated by the scrape of spoons against tin plates. Mira found herself watching the man and the boy. They were so alike in their quietude, yet so different. Reed was a fortress of stillness, his silence forged in the crucible of a hard life. Finn's silence was different. It was an ocean, deep and full of unspoken thoughts and feelings that he communicated through his expressive eyes and eloquent hands. The days that followed settled into a gentle, healing rhythm. Each morning, Mira would wake to find a pail of warm water waiting for her just outside her door, steam rising from it in the cool morning air. Beside it, her worn boots, which she had left caked with mud the night before, would be clean and polished, the leather supple and dark. She never saw Reed do it, but she knew it was him. It was his way of speaking, his silent way of saying, "You are cared for." In return, she found her own ways to speak without words. She discovered a pile of mending in a corner, a collection of Reed's and Finn's work-worn shirts and trousers. She took them, along with a needle and thread she found in a small tin box, and sat on the porch in the afternoon sun, her fingers finding a forgotten skill in the neat, even stitches. She repaired a tear in a horse blanket. She found a saddle with a frayed strap and, using an awl and a leather strip Reed had left on the workbench, she mended it, her stitches clumsy at first, but strong and functional. She learned to cook with what the ranch provided: eggs from the small flock of chickens, vegetables from the garden, the occasional rabbit that Reed brought back from his traps. She learned to bake bread in the Dutch oven buried in the coals of the fire, the smell of it filling the cabin with a warmth that went beyond mere heat. Finn became her constant shadow, her silent teacher. He showed her which plants in the garden were weeds and which were herbs. He taught her the hand signs for water, food, horse, and thank you. He would bring her small gifts: a smooth, flat stone from the creek, a hawk's feather, a handful of wild berries. He would sit with her on the porch while she mended, drawing pictures in the dust with a stick, intricate scenes of horses running free and eagles soaring over the mountains. She began to see that his silent world was not an empty one. It was rich and vibrant, full of a beauty and wisdom that words might only diminish. Reed remained a distant, yet constant, presence. He would spend his days working on the ranch, repairing fences, breaking in a new horse, or riding out into the hills, sometimes for hours at a time. He rarely spoke to her directly, but his awareness of her was palpable. If he saw her struggling to carry a heavy pail of water, he would appear at her side and take it from her without a word. One afternoon, she was sitting on an overturned bucket by the water trough, washing vegetables. The next morning, a small, sturdy wooden stool, newly made and smelling of fresh-cut pine, stood in its place. These small, unspoken acts of kindness were anchors, slowly and gently pulling her back to herself. They were rebuilding her, piece by piece, from the wreckage of her past. She had arrived as a terrified, hunted animal, a creature of pure instinct and fear. But here, in the profound and healing silence of the ranch at the foot of the hills, she was slowly, tentatively, beginning to feel like a person again. She was no longer just running from something. She was beginning to feel that she might, perhaps, have found something to run to. Weeks bled into a month, and the sharp edges of Mira's fear began to soften, worn smooth by the gentle, predictable rhythm of life on the ranch. The constant, vigilant watching of the horizon eased. The habit of flinching at sudden noises began to fade. The sanctuary Reed had provided was more than just a physical shelter. It was a balm for her bruised and battered spirit. She was beginning to forget what it felt like to be afraid every waking moment. The silence of the hills was no longer a place where threats could hide, but a source of deep and abiding peace. The change was not lost on Reed. He saw it in the way she moved, a new ease in her shoulders, a less haunted look in her eyes. He saw it in the way she had begun to truly smile at Finn's dusty drawings, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. He saw the color returning to her cheeks, the healthy glow of someone who was nourished by simple food, hard work, and the profound medicine of safety. But he also saw the shadows that still lingered, the moments when her gaze would turn inward, and a flicker of the old terror would pass across her face like a cloud obscuring the sun. He knew that the story of how she had come to be on that train, a ghost running from ghosts, was still a living thing inside her, a wound that had not yet fully closed. One evening, after a long day of mending a section of fence that had been brought down by a summer storm, they sat by the fire. A cool breeze had swept down from the hills, and the warmth of the hearth was a welcome comfort. Finn, exhausted from a day of helping, which mostly involved carrying single fence posts with great effort and solemnity, had fallen asleep soon after their simple supper of beans and cornbread. He was curled on his cot in the corner, a small, still shape under a patched quilt. The cabin was quiet, filled only with the soft crackle and pop of the burning logs and the distant, mournful call of a coyote. Mira was staring into the flames, her hands wrapped around a wooden cup of chicory coffee. Though she wasn't drinking, the firelight danced in her eyes, illuminating a deep and sorrowful landscape within them. Reed sat across from her at the table, cleaning a bridle with a soft, oiled rag. His movements were slow, methodical, his large hands surprisingly deft. For a long time, he did not speak, allowing the silence to settle around them, a comfortable, familiar blanket. But tonight, the silence felt different. It felt heavier, freighted with the things that had not been said. He finished his task, setting the supple leather aside, and folded his hands on the table. "This place is hard to find," he said, his voice a low rumble that did not disturb the quiet but became a part of it. A man would have to know it was here to get within 5 miles of it. It was not a question, but Mira understood what he was offering. It was an assurance. It was an opening. He was telling her, in his own spare way, that the walls of her sanctuary were strong. She looked up from the fire, her gaze meeting his, in the warm, flickering light. His gray eyes seemed less like chips of stone and more like the soft, quiet color of dusk. "He's good at finding things," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "especially things he thinks belong to him." The words, once spoken, seemed to unlock a door that had been bolted shut for months, the story she had carried alone for so long. A heavy, toxic burden began to spill out, not in a flood, but in a slow, painful trickle. "My father," she began, her eyes dropping back to the mesmerizing dance of the flames, "was a good man, but not a strong one. He had a dreamer's heart and a gambler's hands. He was always sure the next card, the next venture, would be the one to restore our fortunes." She gave a small, sad smile that did not touch her eyes. "It never was." She paused, taking a shaky breath. Reed remained perfectly still, his hands resting on the table, his posture one of absolute, unwavering attention. He was not just listening with his ears, he was listening with his entire being. "He fell into debt," she continued, her voice gaining a slight, tremulous strength as she spoke the ugly truth aloud. "A deep debt to a man named Silas Croft, Mr. Croft owns the biggest saloon, the only hotel, and most of the town of Purgatory Springs. He's a man who likes to own things, people included." She traced the rim of her cup with her finger, her nail making a faint scratching sound on the wood. "When my father couldn't pay, Mr. Croft made him a new offer, an arrangement. He would forgive the debt, all of it, in exchange for me." The word hung in the air between them, ugly and bare. She didn't say, as his wife, or for my hand in marriage. She used the word that Silas himself had used, the word that stripped the arrangement of all pretense and laid its brutal reality bare. An exchange, a transaction, a piece of property changing hands to settle a ledger. My father, he agreed. He told me it was a good match, that Mr. Croft was a man of influence, that I would be secure for the rest of my life. He didn't see the cage. He only saw the gilded bars. She finally took a sip of her coffee. It was cold, but she barely noticed. I was 16. I became Mrs. Croft, and I learned, very quickly, what it meant to be one of his possessions. He was a man who enjoyed his authority. His word was law in his saloon, and it was law in his house. His temper was a physical thing. He believed that what was his, he had the right to correct, to discipline. She did not go into detail. She did not need to. The carefully chosen words, the tremor in her voice, the way she instinctively wrapped her arms around herself as if to ward off a chill, painted a picture more vivid and horrifying than any graphic description could. She spoke of the constant fear, the walking on eggshells, the desperate, soul-crushing effort of trying to be invisible in her own home. She spoke of a life where a misplaced glass or a meal that was not to his liking could result in a long, terrifying night of his cold, controlled anger. Reed's expression did not change. His jaw remained set, his eyes fixed on her, but a muscle twitched. Just once, high on his cheekbone, a tiny, involuntary betrayal of the storm of feeling that must be raging behind his silent facade. "For 2 years, I endured it," Mira said, her voice dropping lower, full of a quiet shame. "I tried to be what he wanted, quiet, obedient, grateful. But something inside me wouldn't break. The more he tried to own me, the more a part of me fought to remain my own. One night, he had been drinking more than usual. He was angry about a card game he had lost, and he decided the fault was mine." She stopped, unable to continue that particular thread of memory. She swallowed hard, pushing the images away. "That was the night I decided I would rather die in the desert than live another day in that house," she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong with the memory of her own resolve. "I took what little money I had managed to hide over the months. I took a loaf of bread and a canteen of water, and while he was asleep, I slipped out the back door and ran. I just ran. The rest of the story came out in a rush, the days of hiding, the near misses, the constant terror of seeing a familiar face in a crowd, the desperate gamble on the last train heading west." She told him about the men he had faced, confirming that they were Croft's men she recognized from the saloon. When she finished, a profound silence descended on the cabin once more. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing, pulsating embers. Mira felt utterly drained, hollowed out, as if she had just shed a heavy, suffocating skin. She had finally given voice to her nightmare, and now, in the quiet aftermath, she waited for judgment, for pity, for the inevitable questions. Reed offered none of them. He simply sat there, a bulwark of stillness in the dim, quiet room. He did not say, "I'm sorry." He did not say, "That's a terrible thing." He did not offer any of the empty words that people use to fill the space left by another's pain. His silence was something else entirely. It was a vessel, strong enough to hold the full weight of her story without cracking. It was a silent testament, a bearing of witness. He had listened, and he had heard. The story was no longer hers alone to carry. He was carrying it with her now. After a long, long time, she stood up, her legs unsteady. I think I'll go to bed now," she murmured, unable to meet his eyes. "Thank you for listening." He gave a single, slow nod. She retreated to her small room and closed the door. But she did not sleep. She lay on her cot, her body trembling with the aftershocks of her confession, and listened to the sounds of the quiet cabin. She expected to hear him move, to bank the fire, to retire to his own bed. Instead, she heard a different set of sounds: the soft creak of leather, the quiet scrape of a wooden stool being moved across the floorboards. Curiosity, stronger than her exhaustion, compelled her to rise. She crept to her door and opened it just a crack, peering into the main room. The fire was now little more than a soft, red glow, casting long, deep shadows. And in those shadows, she saw him. He had brought his heavy stock saddle in from the barn. He had placed it on the floor with its back against the main cabin door, the heavy wooden tree and horn forming a sturdy backrest. He was sitting on the floor, leaning against it, his long legs stretched out before him. His hat was on the floor beside him. His rifle was laid across his lap, his hands resting on the cool steel of the barrel. He was not sleeping. He was watching. He was guarding the door. He was standing his watch. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought her to her knees washed over Mira. It was not pity or fear or even just gratitude. It was a profound, aching recognition of what he was doing. He had heard her story of a monster who hunted her, and his response was not words, but this silent, absolute, unwavering declaration. He was placing his body, his strength, his very life, as a shield between her and the darkness she had escaped. She quietly closed the door, her heart a painful, swelling ache in her chest. She returned to her cot and curled up under the quilt. And for the first time in 2 years, she wept. She wept for the girl she had been, for the father who had failed her, for the life that had been stolen from her. But these were not the tears of despair she had cried so many times before. These were tears of release, of a grief so deep it felt like a cleansing. And as she finally drifted into a deep and dreamless sleep, she did so with the knowledge that for the rest of the night, a silent guardian sat at the door, ensuring that no new nightmares could enter. The next morning, she awoke to the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of Finn quietly setting the table. Reed was not in the cabin. When she stepped out into the main room, her eyes went first to the door. The saddle was gone. The floor was empty. It was as if she had dreamed it. But then her gaze fell upon the hearth, on the flat, warm stone beside the embers of last night's fire. 2 objects had been placed. One was a small, square piece of clean, white linen, folded with perfect precision, a new handkerchief. The other was a small knife, the kind a woman might use for peeling vegetables or cutting thread. Its wooden handle was worn smooth with use, but the blade was new. It gleamed in the morning light, honed to a razor's edge. Mira stared at the 2 objects, her breath caught in her throat. The handkerchief was for her tears, a gesture of comfort. The knife was for her fears, a gift of strength. It was his answer to her story, his silent, eloquent language translated into objects. It said, "I will protect you," but it also said, "You have the power to protect yourself." She picked up the knife, its weight small but solid in her palm. It felt like a promise. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter. The tranquility of the ranch was a deceptive thing. It felt ancient and unbreakable, as if the quiet of the hills had soaked into the very logs of the cabin, making it immune to the clamor of the outside world. The days had fallen into a rhythm so peaceful that Mira had begun to believe the past was truly past, a bad dream from which she had finally awakened. The small knife Reed had given her rested on the crate beside her cot, a symbol not of impending danger, but of her own newfound strength. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long, golden fingers of light across the yard. The air was warm and smelled of hay, dust, and the wild herbs that grew on the hillsides. Mira was in the garden, humming softly to herself as she pulled weeds from around the tomato plants, her hands dark with rich soil. Finn was nearby, meticulously building a small fortress out of twigs and pebbles at the edge of the corral. Reed was in the barn, the rhythmic, metallic ring of a hammer on an anvil echoing in the still air. He was forging something, a new hinge for the barn door, and the steady, powerful beat was as comforting and familiar as a heartbeat. It was a scene of such profound, ordinary peace that the intrusion, when it came, felt like a violation of a sacred space. It began not with a sound, but with a sudden, unnatural silence. The hammering from the barn stopped, mid-beat. The abrupt quiet was more jarring than any noise. Mira looked up from her weeding, a sense of unease prickling at the back of her neck. She saw Reed standing in the wide, shadowed maw of the barn, perfectly still. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking east, out toward the low rise that marked the edge of his property. Then she heard it, a sound that did not belong here, the sound of multiple horses, moving at a steady, purposeful trot. It was the sound of riders who were not just passing by, but who had a destination. Everything inside Mira went cold and still. The sun felt less warm, the air suddenly thin and hard to breathe. She looked at Reed, and in that one shared glance, the idyllic peace of the past month shattered into a million pieces. His face was a mask of cold, hard granite. The quiet rancher was gone. In his place was the man from the train, the man who had faced down 3 armed men with nothing but his voice and a hidden pistol. "Mira!" he said, his voice a low, urgent command that cut through the air. "Get Finn, inside, now!" His tone allowed for no questions, no hesitation. Mira scrambled to her feet, wiping her hands on her dress. "Finn!" she called, her voice tight with a terror she fought to conceal. The boy looked up, his blue eyes wide. He had heard the horses, too. He saw the look on Mira's face, saw Reed standing like a statue at the barn door, and his own small face became a mirror of their tension. He abandoned his fortress and ran to her, his bare feet silent on the dusty ground. He grabbed her hand, his small fingers surprisingly strong. They ran for the cabin. As they reached the porch, Reed was right behind them, his long strides having covered the distance from the barn in seconds. He herded them inside, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "They're still a mile out," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of emotion. "But they ride like they know where they're going." "It's him," Mira whispered, her voice trembling. "It's Silas. He found me." Reed's jaw tightened, but he didn't waste time on confirmations or condolences. "Listen to me, both of you." He knelt, putting himself on a level with Finn, his large hands resting on the boy's small shoulders. He looked directly into Finn's eyes, a silent communication passing between them that was faster and more profound than any words. Finn nodded, his expression one of sober understanding. Reed then looked at Mira. In the floor of the main room, under the bearskin rug, is a trapdoor. It leads to the root cellar. It's small, but there's room for you both. Get in. Do not make a sound. Do not come out. Not for anything. Do you understand?" She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with fear. "I mean it, Mira," he said, his voice hard as iron. "No matter what you hear, you stay put." He stood and moved to the rug, throwing it aside to reveal a section of floorboards with a small, inset iron ring. He pulled, and the heavy door lifted, revealing a square of blackness and the cool, earthy smell of the cellar. A small, rickety ladder led down into the dark. "Go," he commanded. Mira hesitated, her heart crying out in protest. To leave him up here alone to face them, it felt like a betrayal, a cowardice she couldn't bear. "Reed." "There's no time for talk." He cut her off, his voice like the crack of a whip. "My job is to see you're safe. Your job is to stay that way. Now go." Finn, without a moment's hesitation, squeezed her hand and started down the ladder, his movements sure and certain in their shared trust of this man. Mira, her heart breaking, followed him down into the cool, damp darkness. The last thing she saw before Reed lowered the trap door was his face, grim and determined, his pale gray eyes fixed on the cabin door. Then the world went black. The heavy thud of the trap door settling into place was a sound of absolute finality. A moment later, she heard the scrape of the heavy bearskin rug being dragged back over it, plunging them into an even deeper darkness. She stood on the packed earth floor, her senses overwhelmed. The cellar was small, the air thick with the smell of damp soil, potatoes, and fear. She could hear Finn's breathing, a quick, shallow sound beside her. She reached out, her hands finding his small, trembling shoulders. She pulled him close, wrapping her arms around him, trying to shield him with her own body from the terror that was about to unfold above their heads. For a few moments, there was only silence, a deep, listening silence. Then, the sound of the approaching horses grew louder, a drumming beat that seemed to vibrate up through the earth and into the soles of her feet. They were here. She heard the heavy tread of Reed's boots on the floorboards above them. He was moving to the door. She heard the faint creak of the door opening. And then, she heard the voices. "That's him!" a voice snarled. It was a voice she knew, a voice from the train. "That's the fella." "Well, well," another voice said, this one smoother, colder, and infinitely more terrifying. It was a voice that slithered into her memory and coiled around her heart like a venomous snake. Silas Croft. A homesteader. I must say, I'm disappointed in her taste. I thought she'd at least run off with a man of some means. Mira pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob, burying her face in Finn's hair. He was here. He had found her. The monster from her nightmares was standing just a few feet above her head. "You're on private property." Reed's voice came, low and steady. The same deep rumble she had heard on the train. There was no fear in it, only a flat statement of fact. Silas laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Your property. My dear man, everything in this sorry excuse for a territory is my property if I say it is. I'm here for what belongs to me. A girl, about so high, dark hair, answers to the name Mira, or, more accurately, Mrs. Croft. Send her out, and we'll be on our way. No trouble." "There's no one here by that name," Reed said, his voice flat and final. "Don't play games with me, Cowboy." Another of the men growled. "We tracked her right to these hills. She's here." "I'm the only one here." Reed stated, "You've been misled." "Then you won't mind if we take a look for ourselves," Silas said, his voice slick with false politeness. "Jeb, Harlan, check the house. Be thorough." Mira's heart stopped. She heard the heavy stomp of boots on the porch, then on the floorboards directly above her head. They were in the cabin. She and Finn huddled together, trying to shrink into the very earth, holding their breath until their lungs burned. The heavy footsteps moved around the small room, the sound deafeningly loud in their confined space. She heard them open the door to her small room, then the thud of them overturning her cot. "Nothing in here, boss," Jeb called out. "Place as clean as a whistle." "Check the barn," Silas commanded. "Check everywhere. She's here. I can smell her fear." The footsteps moved back toward the door. Mira allowed herself a tiny, fractional moment of relief. They were leaving the cabin. But then she heard Reed's voice, closer to the trap door now. "If you're looking for a runaway, maybe I did see someone," he said, his tone conversational, almost helpful. "A man passed through yesterday, looked spooked, said he was heading for the old stable up the canyon, rode his horse into the ground. It was a diversion, a lie, a brilliant, dangerous lie designed to do one thing: get them out of the cabin and away from her hiding place." "A man?" Silas asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "She wasn't with a man." "Can't say," Reed replied, his voice receding as he presumably moved out onto the porch with them. "Just telling you what I saw. He was in a hurry. Left in that direction." There was a moment of silence. and Mira could picture them. Silas and his men, looking in the direction Reed was pointing, weighing the lie. "All right," Silas said finally. "We'll check the barn first. Harlan, you stay with our friend here. Make sure he doesn't get any ideas." The main group of footsteps moved away, crunching on the dusty ground of the yard as they headed for the barn. But one set remained on the porch, a heavy, menacing presence. Mira waited, every nerve screaming. What was Reed's plan? What could he possibly do against so many? Then she heard it, a sudden, sharp grunt from the porch, followed by a sickening, wet thud, as if a fist had met flesh. There was a heavier thud as a body hit the wooden planks of the porch. A moment of absolute silence. Then Reed's voice, a low, urgent whisper that seemed to come from right above the trap door. "Stay down." Before she could even process the words, she heard the sound of running feet, Reed's boots pounding the earth as he sprinted toward the barn. A furious shout erupted from that direction. "Hey, he got Harlan?" The next sounds came in a rapid, terrifying succession. A crash of splintering wood, the terrified, high-pitched scream of a horse, a man's cry of pain and surprise. Reed had done what the plan in her mind suggested. He had thrown one of them into a horse stall. And then the world exploded in gunfire. The first shot was a deafening crack that vibrated through the floorboards and into Mira's bones. She clamped her hands over Finn's ears, pulling him so tight against her she thought he might break. Another shot followed, then a third, the reports echoing off the hillsides, a brutal, percussive symphony of violence. Then silence, a silence more terrifying than the gunshots, a deep, ringing, absolute silence. Who had fired? Who had been hit? Was Reed still standing? The question screamed in Mira's mind, a frantic, silent chorus. She strained her ears, listening for any sound, any sign of life. A footstep, a groan, anything. There was nothing, only the sudden, gentle whisper of the wind, which seemed to be mourning the violence that had just desecrated this peaceful place. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Finn was shaking uncontrollably in her arms, his face buried in her dress. Mira's own body was rigid with a terror so profound it felt like death itself. He wasn't coming back. The silence meant he was down. He had given his life to protect her, and she had brought this plague upon him, upon this beautiful, quiet life he had built with the boy. Silas had won. He would find her now. He would drag her out of this hole and back to a life that was 1,000 times worse than death. And the only man who had ever shown her true, selfless kindness would be lying dead in the dust outside. The despair was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. And then a sound. A single set of footsteps, slow, heavy, dragging slightly, coming back toward the cabin. Mira's blood ran cold. Was it Reed, or was it one of them, coming back to finish the job? To find the prize his boss had sent him for? She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She could only listen as the footsteps mounted the porch, crossed the floorboards, and stopped directly over the trap door. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the end. She heard a soft groan of effort, a scraping sound. And then, a sliver of golden afternoon light sliced through the darkness. The trapdoor was being lifted. Mira looked up, her heart frozen in her chest. A figure was silhouetted against the bright opening, a dark, hulking shape. For a terrifying second, she couldn't tell who it was. Then, the figure knelt, and the light fell on his face. It was Reed. His face was pale beneath its tan, etched with exhaustion and pain. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. Dust and grime streaked his face, but his eyes, when they met hers, were clear and steady. He was alive. He looked down at them, huddled in the darkness, and the hard lines of his face softened for just a fraction of a second. "It's over," he said, his voice raspy, strained. "They're gone." Relief, so powerful and absolute it was physically painful, washed over Mira, making her weak. Tears she hadn't known she was holding streamed down her face. Finn let out a small, choked sob and scrambled up the ladder, throwing himself into Reed's arms. Reed caught him, holding him tight with one arm, his other hand hanging limply at his side. It was then that Mira saw the blood. His right hand was covered in it, a dark, viscous red that dripped slowly from his fingertips onto the cabin floor. She climbed the ladder, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. She emerged from the darkness into the light, blinking, her gaze fixed on his bleeding hand. He stood, still holding Finn, and looked down at her, his expression grim. He was standing. He was hurt, but he was standing. He had faced them down, and he had won. The silent guardian had held the line. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her face, checking for any sign of injury. His concern, even now, for her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Mira couldn't find the words to answer. She could only nod, her eyes locked on his. And then, without thinking, she reached out and took his bloody hand in both of her own. A silent, desperate, and deeply grateful touch. The world outside the cellar, once a sanctuary, had transformed into a scene of brutal, chaotic violence. The aftermath was a landscape of unnatural stillness. Near the barn, 2 bodies lay in the dust, sprawled in the final, awkward postures of death. A third man was slumped against the corral fence, his head at an unnatural angle. The horses Silas and his men had ridden were gone, having bolted in terror at the sound of gunfire. The air was thick with the acrid, metallic smell of gunpowder and something coppery that turned Mira's stomach. Her initial wave of relief at seeing Reed alive was so powerful it was dizzying, but it was immediately chased by a new, sharper fear. The blood dripping from his hand was a stark, vivid red against the pale gold of the afternoon light. It was a detail that screamed of the violence he had just endured for her sake. He swayed slightly on his feet, the strong arm holding Finn tightening for balance. "They won't be coming back," he said, his voice a ragged edge of its usual deep rumble. He looked from Mira to the bodies in the yard, and a shadow of something cold and weary passed over his face. He had killed to protect them, and the weight of that act, necessary as it was, had settled upon him. "You're hurt," Mira whispered, her voice trembling as she gently held his bleeding hand. It was a clumsy gesture, but it was all she could think to do. Reed looked down at his hand as if noticing it for the first time. "It's a scratch." But it wasn't just a scratch. As her eyes adjusted to the bright light, she saw the dark, spreading stain on his left shoulder, high up near his collarbone. The tear in his shirt she had noticed before was not just a tear. It was a bullet hole. The blood on his hand wasn't from a wound on his hand at all. It was from where he had instinctively pressed it to the more serious injury on his shoulder. "Reed," she said, her voice rising in panic. "Your shoulder." He followed her gaze, his expression unchanging. "It's fine." He was lying. The color was draining from his face, leaving his skin a pale, ashen gray beneath his tan. A fine sheen of sweat had broken out on his forehead. He took a step toward the cabin porch, then faltered, his body lurching to one side. If it weren't for the door frame, he would have fallen. Finn cried out, a small, choked sound of pure terror, clinging to him. "Reed!" Mira cried, rushing forward to support his other side. The solid wall of muscle she had leaned against on horseback now felt terrifyingly fragile. His full weight sagged against her, and she staggered under the load. "Finn, help me!" The boy, his face streaked with tears and dust, immediately understood. He moved to Reed's other side, wrapping his small arms around his waist, adding his meager strength to hers. Together, the woman and the boy. They half-carried, half-dragged their protector across the porch and into the cabin. He collapsed onto his cot, the small frame groaning in protest. He fell not into sleep, but into a deep, unnerving state of unconsciousness, his head lolling to the side, his breathing suddenly shallow and labored. The silent, invincible man was gone. In his place was a desperately wounded, vulnerable human being. For a moment, Mira was paralyzed by a fear more profound than any she had felt hiding in the cellar, out there, facing Silas's men. She had been a passive victim, here in this cabin, with this man's life bleeding out onto the rough cotton sheets. She was the only one who could act. His survival depended entirely on her, and she knew nothing. She was not a nurse. She had never tended to anything more serious than a scraped knee. She looked at Finn, who was staring at Reed, his blue eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea. That look, the look of a child terrified of losing the only parent he had ever known, broke through her paralysis. She could not fall apart. She could not be weak, not now. "Water," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Finn, bring me a basin of clean water and all the rags you can find." The boy nodded, his terror transmuting into purpose, and scurried to obey. Mira took the small knife from her bedside crate. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them still, with the sharp, honed blade. She carefully cut away the fabric of Reed's shirt around the wound. The sight that was revealed made her stomach clench. It was a deep, ragged puncture, the flesh around it already beginning to swell and discolor. It wasn't bleeding as profusely as she had feared, but that in itself was a worrying sign. Finn returned with the water and a stack of clean linen, torn from old flour sacks. Mira dipped a rag in the cool water and, taking a deep, steadying breath, began to clean the wound. She worked with a slow, gentle touch, her mind a blank slate of pure focus. She had to get the dirt and cloth fibers out. She had to see how deep it went. The next 3 days became a blur, a waking nightmare of fear, exhaustion, and desperate, ceaseless care. The bullet, she discovered, had gone clean through, a small mercy in a sea of horrors. But the damage it had done to muscle and bone was severe, and soon, a new, more insidious enemy arrived: fever. By the second day, his skin was hot and dry to the touch, and a deep, feverish flush had settled high on his cheekbones. He began to murmur, his voice rough and strange, his words disjointed fragments of a life she knew nothing about. He spoke of a place called Shiloh, of a river red with something other than clay. He called out names: Elias, Sarah, his voice filled with a phantom grief. He was no longer in the cabin in the quiet hills of Arizona. He was trapped somewhere else, in a past as wounded and bloody as his shoulder. His silence, which had once been a fortress, was now a terrifying void. She found she could not bear it, and so she began to talk. She sat on a small stool beside his cot, a cool, damp cloth in her hand, and she filled the quiet, fever-heavy air with her own voice. She didn't talk about Silas or Purgatory Springs. To speak of that darkness in this room felt like a sacrilege. Instead, she reached back, past the fear and the pain, to a time before her life had been bartered away. She spoke of her mother. "Her name was Annalise," she whispered, her voice soft as she gently wiped the sweat from his brow. "She smelled of cinnamon and yeast. She had a garden, not a practical one like yours, but a riot of flowers, hollyhocks and roses and lavender. She said a person needed to feed their soul just as much as their belly." She talked for hours, her voice a low, steady murmur. She told him about the creek she used to play in as a child, about the smooth, flat stones she would collect, believing they were magic. She told him about a stray dog she had once befriended, a scruffy, one-eared creature she had named Patches, and how she had fed him scraps from the kitchen until her father had found out and sent him away. She was not talking for him, not really. He was lost in his fevered dreams, deaf to her words. She was talking for herself, and for Finn. The boy was her constant, silent companion. He rarely left the cabin, sitting on the floor by the cot, his small hand often resting on Reed's still one, as if he could will his own life force into the man. When Mira's voice would falter with exhaustion or emotion, Finn would look up at her, his eyes full of encouragement, silently urging her to continue. So she would take a sip of water and begin another story. She was weaving a tapestry of a life of simple, small beauties, and hanging it in the air of the sick room, a charm against the encroaching shadows. It was a way to hold on to the light, to remind herself, and the sleeping man, that the world was not made entirely of violence and fear. It was also made of lavender, and skipping stones, and the unconditional love of a one-eared dog. She fed him, forcing spoonfuls of thin, watery broth between his cracked lips. Most of it dribbled down his chin, but she would gently wipe it away and try again. She and Finn worked as a team. He would fetch fresh water, hold the bowl, and watch with an old man's gravity as she tended to their patient. He seemed to understand, with an instinct that went beyond his years, that their survival, their small, fragile family, hinged on the life of the man on the cot. On the third night, the fever reached its peak. Reed's body was rigid with chills, his teeth chattering, though his skin burned like a furnace. He thrashed in his delirium, his strong arms flailing, and it took both Mira's and Finn's weight to hold him down and keep him from further injuring himself. His murmurs became cries, shouts of warning and despair from a long-ago battlefield. Mira, her heart aching with a terrifying, helpless love for this broken man, could do nothing but hold him, bathe his face, and whisper soothing, nonsensical words until the storm passed. Sometime before dawn, it broke. She felt the change before she saw it. The violent shivering subsided, replaced by a deep, shuddering sigh. The rigid tension left his limbs. She placed a hand on his forehead, and for the first time in 2 days, it was cool and damp with a healthy sweat, not the dry, burning heat of fever. She sagged with a relief so profound it left her weak and trembling. She looked over at Finn, who had fallen asleep in a chair, his small head slumped onto his chest. She gently brushed a lock of blonde hair from his face, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love for them both. These two silent, wounded souls had become her entire world. She sat with him as the first, pale light of dawn crept into the cabin, chasing away the long shadows of the night. His breathing was deep and even now, the peaceful breathing of true sleep. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, a simple, beautiful rhythm that was the most precious music she had ever heard. She was exhausted, her body aching from lack of sleep, her spirit frayed to a thread, but she felt a quiet, fierce sense of triumph. They had weathered the storm. He was going to live. A few hours later, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, she saw his eyelids flicker. She held her breath, her heart suddenly pounding in her throat. His eyes, which had been closed for 3 days, slowly opened. They were no longer clouded with fever and delirium. They were clear. They were his eyes, the color of a winter sky, and they were looking directly at her. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her tired, pale face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she sat hunched on the stool as if she had been there for a lifetime. His eyes moved around the quiet cabin, resting for a moment on the sleeping form of Finn, then returned to her. A flicker of confusion, then memory, then understanding passed through them. She expected him to ask what had happened, to ask about his wound, to ask about the pain that must be screaming from his shoulder. She opened her mouth to try and explain, to tell him he had been sick, that the fever was gone, that everything was going to be all right. But he spoke first. His voice was a dry, hoarse rasp, a faint echo of its usual strength. But the words were clear. "Are you all right?" The question struck her with the force of a physical blow. After everything he had been through, after the gunfight, the wound, the fever that had almost taken him, his first conscious thought, his first words, were not for himself. They were for her. He was checking on her safety. He was still, even in his own profound weakness, the protector. All the strength that had sustained her for the past 3 days, all her carefully constructed composure, crumbled in that one selfless moment A single tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She couldn't find the words to answer him. She could only nod. A jerky, convulsive movement, as more tears followed. Silent tears of exhaustion, of relief, and of a deep, overwhelming emotion for which she had no name. The violence of the attack gave way to a long, quiet season of healing. The world of the ranch, which had been so brutally violated, slowly began to mend itself. Mira and Finn, with a grim determination, had cleaned the yard, erasing the physical scars of the confrontation. The bodies were gone, buried in unmarked graves far out in the hills. A somber task that Reed had insisted on directing from the porch as soon as he was able to sit up. His voice low and strained, his face pale. He had given the dead a measure of respect he had not afforded them in life, and in doing so, had closed a brutal chapter. Reed's recovery was a slow, frustrating affair for a man accustomed to ceaseless action. The fever had left him weak, and the wound in his shoulder, though clean and beginning to heal under Mira's diligent care, ached with a deep, persistent pain. He was no longer confined to the cot, but his world had shrunk to the dimensions of the cabin's porch. He would sit for hours in a sturdy rocking chair Finn had dragged out for him, his left arm in a sling Mira had fashioned from a clean linen sheet, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy line of the mountains. A new dynamic settled over the small, three-person household. The roles had been completely reversed. Mira was no longer the protected, but the protector, the patient, but the caregiver. She changed his bandages each morning, her touch gentle but firm, her movements efficient and practiced now. She cooked for him, making nourishing broths and simple stews that he ate with a quiet, sometimes begrudging, acceptance. She managed the daily chores, with Finn as her solemn and hard-working apprentice, feeding the chickens, tending the garden, and ensuring the steady, comforting rhythm of the homestead continued unabated. Reed, for his part, struggled with his own helplessness. He was a man whose identity was inextricably linked to his strength, his capability, his role as a provider and guardian. To be forced into this passive, dependent state was a profound trial. Mira could see the frustration simmering behind his stony expression as he watched her carry heavy buckets of water from the pump, or mend a fence post with clumsy, determined effort. But he did not complain. He endured his convalescence with the same profound stillness with which he endured everything else. A mountain weathering a long and difficult storm. In this quiet interlude, a new form of communication began to blossom between them. A language spoken not with words, but with small, deliberate gestures. Their world was one of glances, of shared silence, of objects left and found. Mira would find he had used his one good hand to painstakingly peel a bucket of potatoes for her while she was in the garden. She, in turn, would read to him in the evenings from an old, tattered copy of Shakespeare that she had found tucked away in a chest, her voice a soft, soothing murmur in the firelight as he rested his eyes. One afternoon, a week into his recovery, Mira was returning from a walk along the creek bed. She had needed to escape the confines of the sick room for a few moments, to breathe air that did not smell of poultices and confinement. The hills were awash in the muted colors of late summer, and she found herself noticing the small, tenacious beauties of the landscape for the first time since the attack. Tucked in the shelter of a large, sun-warmed boulder, a single defiant wildflower was blooming. It was a desert marigold, its petals a splash of brilliant, cheerful yellow against the dusty red of the rock. It was a small, perfect thing, a testament to the resilience of life in this harsh, unforgiving land. On an impulse she didn't fully understand, she plucked it carefully from its stem. She carried it back to the cabin, its sunny face a small spot of brightness in her palm. Reed was on the porch, sitting in his customary chair, his gaze distant. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable. She felt a sudden, inexplicable shyness. The flower, which had seemed like such a simple, beautiful thing, now felt like a foolish, childish offering. Instead of handing it to him directly, a gesture that felt too bold, too intimate, she simply walked past his chair and gently placed the small, yellow blossom on the edge of the wooden porch step, near his feet. She didn't say a word. She just set it there, a silent, humble gift of color and life, and then retreated into the cabin, her cheeks feeling unaccountably warm. She expected him to ignore it, to let it be swept away by the evening breeze, a forgotten piece of sentiment. She did not see him bend, slowly and with a pained grunt, to pick it up. She did not see him hold it in his calloused palm, his thumb gently stroking the delicate, velvety petals. The next day, she had all but forgotten the small gesture. Reed seemed a little stronger, and had asked for his small, leather-bound notebook and a pencil, saying he needed to make some notes about winter supplies. He worked at the main table for a while, his brow furrowed in concentration as he wrote with the slow, deliberate strokes of his uninjured hand. Later, he went back out to the porch, leaving the notebook on the table. As Mira was clearing away the midday meal, a gust of wind from the open door blew through the cabin, rustling the pages of the notebook. It fell open to a page near the back. Mira went to close it, her sense of propriety not allowing her to pry into his private affairs. But as she reached for the cover, her eyes fell upon the open page, and she froze. There, carefully placed between 2 pages of neatly written lists and calculations, was the desert marigold. It was already beginning to flatten, its vibrant yellow preserved against the creamy paper. He had saved it. He had taken her small, impulsive offering and tucked it away in the most private of his possessions, pressing it between the pages of his life as if it were a thing of great value. A warmth spread through Mira's chest, a feeling so sweet and sharp it almost made her gasp. It was a secret she had stumbled upon, a silent message she was not meant to see but which spoke volumes. This man, this silent, stoic man, held a gentle, tender place within him, and she had, without realizing it, touched it. As the days turned into another week, Reed grew stronger. He began to take short, slow walks around the yard, his left arm still in its sling, but his stride becoming steadier. Sure, he was still a long way from being able to ride or perform the heavy labor the ranch demanded, and his frustration with his limitations was a palpable thing. He needed to be useful. He needed to do. Mira had fallen into the habit of taking her basket of vegetables to the large water trough in the yard to wash them for their evening meal. It was cooler there than in the cabin, and the late afternoon sun was pleasant on her back. She would sit on an old, overturned wooden bucket, a perch that was uncomfortable and wobbly, but it served its purpose. Reed had often watched her from the porch, his gaze following her as she worked, though he never commented. One morning, she heard a new sound from the barn, a soft, rhythmic, rasping sound. It was the sound of a handsaw on wood. It was followed by the gentle, intermittent tap of a hammer. The sounds continued for most of the day, and then for the next. It was a quiet, purposeful industry. Mira was curious, but she did not ask. She understood that Reed needed this work, this small project that was within the capabilities of his one good hand. It was his way of reclaiming a piece of himself. On the third morning, the sounds from the barn had ceased. When Mira went out in the late afternoon with her basket of freshly picked carrots and potatoes, she stopped dead in her tracks. The overturned bucket was gone. In its place, standing exactly where she always worked, was a small, new, beautifully made wooden stool. It was a simple, sturdy thing, crafted from clean, pale pine. The legs were perfectly angled. The seat sanded so smooth it shone with a soft, satiny luster in the afternoon light. It was the work of a skilled and patient craftsman, a piece of functional art made with care and precision. There was no flourish, no decoration. Its beauty was in its perfect simplicity, its quiet strength. He had built it for her. He had watched her day after day, Sitting uncomfortably on that wobbly bucket, he had seen her small, uncomplaining discomfort, and he had decided to fix it. He had taken his need to be useful, his frustration at his own weakness, and channeled it into this single, perfect act of care. Mira slowly approached the stool, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm in her chest. She reached out and ran her hand over the smooth, warm wood. It was solid. It was real. She sat down on it, and it held her perfectly. A comfortable, steady seat that felt as if it had been made just for her. And in that moment, sitting on the stool he had made, the scattered pieces of the last few months clicked into place, forming a picture of breathtaking clarity. It was a language she had been hearing since the night she first stumbled onto that train, but only now was she beginning to truly understand its grammar. It was a language of actions, not words. The heavy duster coat he had opened for her on the train had been a word. It said, shelter. The silent, deadly way he had faced down Silas's men had been a sentence. It said, you are protected. The warm water and the polished boots left outside her door each morning were a quiet, daily poem. They sang, you are cared for. The sharpened knife left by the hearth after she told him her story had been a profound statement. It declared, you are not weak. You have the power to defend yourself. The delicate, yellow wildflower, pressed so carefully between the pages of his private ledger, was the most intimate whisper of all. It said, you are beautiful. You are precious. She looked at the stool, this simple, sturdy object, a thing made to make her life just a little bit easier, a little more comfortable, and she finally understood the meaning of this latest, most solid word in his silent vocabulary. It was a word that spoke of permanence, of a place that had been made for her. All of these gestures, these quiet, profound acts of service and care, were not random kindnesses. They were a conversation, a long, slow, patient courtship, and every single action, from the grand to the minuscule, had been saying the same thing, over and over again. Stay. It was not a command. It was not a demand. It was a question, an invitation, a quiet, heartfelt plea, offered up by a man who did not have the words, but who had something far more valuable, a deep and abiding truth in his hands, in his heart, in every silent, protective, and gentle thing he did. And as the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the quiet ranch, Mira felt a smile, the first truly, deeply happy smile she had felt in years, spread across her face. The high, thin air of the Arizona autumn settled over the ranch as the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and deep, bruised purple. A profound quiet descended, a peace that was no longer new and fragile, but had begun to feel as solid and enduring as the ancient rocks that sheltered the small homestead. Reed's shoulder had healed, leaving behind a puckered, angry scar that he now bore with the same stoic indifference as the other, older marks that mapped his body. He was back to his full strength, and the familiar rhythmic sounds of his work once again provided the daily heartbeat of the ranch. Life had settled into a routine that was as comforting as it was predictable. The days were filled with the quiet industry of survival, mending fences, tending to the horses, harvesting the last of the garden's bounty, and preparing for the coming winter. The nights were islands of peace, spent in the warm, fire-lit cabin. The silence broken only by the crackle of the logs or the soft murmur of Mira's voice as she read aloud to Finn. The fear that had been Mira's constant companion for so long had receded, becoming a faint, distant echo rather than a constant, screaming presence. She had learned the contours of this new life, had found her place within its quiet rhythms. She felt a sense of belonging so deep it sometimes frightened her, a contentment so profound it felt like a dream from which she was terrified of waking. She was no longer just a guest, a refugee. She was a part of this place. Her hands had helped to grow the food they ate. Her stitches held their clothes together. Her presence had helped to turn the Spartan cabin into a home. But peace, for someone who had known only turmoil, could be a disquieting thing. It felt unearned. It felt temporary, in the quietest moments. A cold sliver of doubt would work its way into her heart. She would watch Reed as he moved about the yard, his strength and competence a thing of silent, unassuming beauty, and she would feel a chasm open between them. He was a man of the earth, as solid and dependable as the ground beneath his feet. He had faced down death for her, had built a sanctuary for her with his own 2 hands. And what was she, a ghost from a soiled past? A woman who had brought bloodshed and violence to his doorstep. She was the weakness in his fortress, the unlocked door through which trouble could enter. This evening, after a simple supper of rabbit stew and fresh bread, the 3 of them sat on the porch as they often did, watching the stars begin to prick the deep, velvet canvas of the sky. Finn, tired from a day of adventurous exploration, was curled between them, his head resting in Mira's lap, his breathing deep and even in sleep. The air was cool and crisp, and Mira had pulled a thick wool blanket around her shoulders. Reed sat in his rocking chair, perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, a dark, solid silhouette against the fading light. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, the only sound the gentle creak of the rocker and the distant chorus of crickets. The peace was so complete, so absolute, that it felt like a tangible thing, something she could reach out and touch, and yet it was this very peace that was causing a storm to gather inside her. She had a choice to make. She had been avoiding it for weeks, pushing it to the back of her mind, content to live in the simple, uncomplicated present. But she could not live in the present forever. A future was beginning to take shape here, a future that was silently being offered to her in every glance, in every quiet act of care. The stool he had built for her, the flower he had pressed in his book, they were not just gestures of kindness. They were questions. They were invitations, and they demanded an answer. Could she accept? Could she truly lay down the burden of her past and take her place in this new life? Did she have the right? The very thought of leaving, of walking away from this sanctuary, from Reed and Finn, was a physical pain, a tearing sensation in her chest. But the thought of staying, of weaving her own damaged, frayed thread into the strong, clean fabric of their lives, felt like an act of profound selfishness. She felt like a fraud, a broken thing masquerading as a whole person, and she was terrified that one day he would look at her and see the truth, that he would see not the capable woman who ran his home, but the terrified girl who had hidden under his coat, the harbinger of violence who had nearly gotten him killed. Her heart began to beat a little faster. The words she needed to say, the questions that had been haunting her, rose in her throat, a bitter, fearful taste. She looked at Reed's profile, the strong, uncompromising line of his jaw, the steady set of his shoulders. He was looking out at the darkness, but she knew he was not unaware of her. He was aware of everything, of the slightest shift in the wind, of the faintest change in her breathing. She had to speak. To continue in this state of silent uncertainty felt like a lie. She gently shifted Finn's sleeping form, laying his head on a cushion beside her, and stood up. She walked to the edge of the porch, wrapping the blanket tighter around herself, her back to him. She stared out at the vast, star-dusted darkness, a mirror of the terrifying uncertainty within her. "Reed," she said, her voice so soft it was almost stolen by the breeze. The gentle creaking of the rocking chair stopped. He was listening. She took a shaky breath, her hands clenching the rough wool of the blanket. She felt his gaze on her back, a steady, patient weight. "All of this," she began, making a small, vague gesture at the ranch, at the hills, at the peaceful night sky. "This life, what you've given me, what you've built here, it's more than I ever thought I could have. It's quiet, and it's safe." She paused, struggling to find the right words. "But I think maybe I've forgotten how to live in the quiet. I think I might be broken in a way that can't be fixed. The fear, it doesn't scream anymore, but it still whispers. It tells me that peace like this isn't meant for people like me. It tells me that I'll bring the storm here again, that I already did." Her voice trembled on the last words, thick with a guilt she could no longer bear in silence. She had never spoken of it, of the fact that his scar was her fault, that the graves on the hill were her fault. "I am trying to be the person that this place deserves," she whispered, turning to face him now, her eyes pleading with him in the dim starlight. "I am trying so hard to be strong, to be enough. But what if I'm not? What if, when the time comes to be brave, I just run again?" The question hung in the cool night air between them, fragile and raw. It was the deepest, most vulnerable part of her, laid bare. She took another step toward him, her voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper, the question that was the terrified, beating heart of it all. "What if I change my mind?" She searched his face for a reaction, for a flicker of anger, of disappointment, of impatience. She expected him to stand up, to perhaps put a comforting but dismissive hand on her shoulder and tell her not to be foolish. She expected him to offer a simple, easy reassurance that would quiet her fears, but not truly answer her question. He did none of those things. He did not move. He did not turn away. He did not even blink. His gaze remained locked on hers, his expression as steady and unchanging as the northern star. And crucially, he did not reach for her. He did not try to soothe her with a touch. He met her terrifying, soul-deep vulnerability with nothing but the absolute, unwavering stillness of his presence. He was giving her fear the respect of his full attention. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the deep rumble she was used to. It was a sound as soft as the cool night air, as gentle as the rustle of dry leaves. "Then we wait." The 3 words were so simple, so unexpected, they seemed to stop the very motion of the world. Mira could only stare at him, her mind struggling to comprehend the immensity of what he had just offered her. Wait. It was a concept so foreign to her experience, it was like a word from an unknown language. Her entire life had been a series of violent, irreversible moments, of desperate actions and their immediate, often brutal, consequences. There was no waiting. There was only running, or fighting, or enduring. The idea of simply being allowed to be in a state of uncertainty was a grace she had never imagined. He saw the confusion and the dawning hope in her eyes, and he continued, his voice still that same quiet, profound whisper. "You don't have to decide everything tonight, Mira. You don't have to decide anything alone." And that was it. That was the moment she broke. A sob, thick and heavy, tore its way from her chest. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in her eyes and streamed down her face. But they were not the tears of fear she had cried so many times before. They were not tears of grief or of pain. They were tears of a relief so profound, so absolute. It was a physical agony, a breaking of a dam that had been holding back a lifetime of pressure. She cried for the girl who had been forced to be a woman at 16. She cried for the woman who had been forced to be strong when all she felt was terror. She cried for the survivor who felt the crushing, unspoken guilt of her own survival. She had been forcing herself to be brave, to be worthy, to be healed, believing that was the only way she could earn her place here, the only way she could deserve his kindness. And with 2 simple sentences, he had swept all of that pressure away. Then we wait. He was giving her time. He was giving her permission to be unsure, to be afraid, to be unfinished. He was not demanding strength from her. He was offering a space where she could find her own, at her own pace. You don't have to decide alone. He was not waiting for her. He was waiting with her. He was stepping into her fear, into her uncertainty, and standing beside her in it. The terrible, crushing weight of her past and her future was no longer hers alone to carry. The simple, powerful word, "we," had made him a partner in her struggle, not just a spectator. She sank onto the porch step, her face in her hands, and wept with an abandoned, wrenching grief for all the times she had been forced to be certain, for all the times hesitation had meant danger. Reed did not move from his chair. He did not rush to comfort her, did not try to stem the tide of her tears with platitudes or touch. He simply sat in the darkness, a silent, unwavering sentinel, giving her the final, most precious gift he possessed, the space and the safety to finally fall apart. He was allowing her to be fragile, and in doing so, was giving her the only thing that could ever truly make her strong. He was giving her permission to hesitate. The night of Mira's tears did not bring a storm, but a quiet, cleansing rain that washed the landscape of their lives clean. The confession on the porch was not an ending, but a new and fragile beginning. In the days that followed, the air in the cabin seemed lighter, clearer. Reed did not treat her like a broken thing to be pitied or a fragile piece of glass to be handled with care. He treated her, instead, with a new and profound respect, as if she were a veteran of a long and brutal war who had finally, bravely, laid down her arms. He had given her the gift of time, the grace of uncertainty, and in doing so, he had given her back to herself. The frantic, unspoken pressure she had put on herself to be healed, to be whole, to be worthy, simply dissolved. She discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the quiet, daily choice to get up in the morning and face the day, knowing that the ghosts of the past might still whisper, but they no longer had the power to scream. Her movements about the ranch took on a new, unburdened quality. The tightness in her shoulders, a posture she had held for so long she had forgotten what it was to be without it, had finally begun to release its grip. Her smile, when it came, was quicker and more genuine, especially in her silent, playful interactions with Finn. She was no longer just surviving in this sanctuary. She was beginning to live in it. It was a late afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after that night. The sun was warm on their backs, and a gentle breeze, carrying the sweet, dry scent of hay and distant pine, drifted down from the hills. Mira was on the porch, patching one of Finn's shirts, her stitches small and even. Finn himself was in the yard, engaged in a great and serious battle with an army of grasshoppers, his bare feet stirring up small puffs of dust. Reed emerged from the barn, his work for the day apparently done. He wiped his hands on a rag, his movements economical and sure. He stood for a moment, watching Finn's imaginary war with a faint, almost imperceptible softening around his mouth. Then his eyes lifted and met Mira's across the sun-drenched yard. He did not speak. He did not have to. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then, with a slight inclination of his head, he looked toward the creek bed, toward the place where the land sloped down before rising again into the rolling hills. It was a question, an invitation, posed in his silent, eloquent language. Walk with me. Mira's heart gave a single, strong beat. She carefully folded the shirt she was mending. Setting it and her sewing basket aside, she stood, her own gaze never leaving his. She nodded once, a simple, clear answer. Yes. He waited for her as she came down the porch steps, the worn wood warm beneath her bare feet. They fell into step beside each other, their shoulders not quite touching, walking in a comfortable, shared silence. They did not head for the well-worn path that led to the creek, but for a fainter trail, a deer path that wound its way through the tall, golden grasses toward a place she remembered with a sweet, sharp ache of recognition. It was the place where she had found the flower. The walk was not long, but it felt like a journey of 1,000 miles. This was the first time they had walked together like this, not as rescuer and fugitive, not as patient and caregiver, but simply as a man and a woman, moving through a landscape that was beginning to feel like home. The sun warmed her skin, and the earth felt solid and real beneath her feet. She was intensely aware of him beside her, of the quiet strength in his stride, of the way the sun caught the lines etched at the corners of his eyes. They came to the sheltered hollow, the place where the large, sun-warmed boulders created a small haven of warmth and stillness. And there, just as she remembered, was a small, vibrant community of desert marigolds, their brilliant yellow faces turned up to the afternoon sun. They were a testament to the stubborn, tenacious beauty of this land, a splash of impossible color in a world of muted earth tones. They stopped at the edge of the small patch of wildflowers, the silence between them filled with the hum of insects and the soft sigh of the wind. Mira looked at the flowers, her mind flashing back to the day she had picked a single bloom, a small, impulsive offering that had ended up pressed between the pages of his private world. It had been the beginning of this new language she was learning, a language of small, precious things. She felt him shift beside her. She turned her head to look at him, and found he was already looking at her. And in his eyes, in their clear, winter sky gray depths, she saw an emotion she had never seen there before. It was not just care, not just protection. It was a deep, quiet, and profound tenderness, a vulnerability that mirrored the one she had shown him on the porch. It was the look of a man who had decided, a long time ago, that his heart had found its home. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand. It was his right hand, the one that had held the gun that had saved her, the one that had borne the blood of his sacrifice. She saw him hesitate for the barest fraction of a second, a silent question, giving her a final chance to turn away. She did not move. She did not even breathe. And then, he reached out and took her hand in his. It was not a taking, but an offering. His skin was rough with the history of his life, calloused from hard labor and the unforgiving elements. His hand was large, strong, enveloping her smaller one completely. Yet his hold was so light, so careful, as if he were holding a fragile, sleeping bird. The warmth of his skin seeped into hers, a current of quiet, steady strength. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. Her fingers, of their own accord, curled around his, accepting the connection, accepting the profound, unspoken promise in the simple, powerful gesture. There were no words. There were no vows exchanged, no promises of forever whispered on the wind. There was no hurried, passionate kiss. There was only this, the quiet, solid weight of his hand in hers. It was a more honest, more powerful commitment than any words could ever be. It was a treaty signed between two wounded souls, a silent agreement to face the unknown future, together. They stood like that for a long, timeless moment, two still figures in a sea of golden grass and yellow flowers. In the near distance, they could hear a peal of delighted, silent laughter as Finn, having finally vanquished the grasshopper army, began to chase a large, blue butterfly that was dancing just out of his reach. He darted through the wildflowers, his small, joyful form, a symbol of the new life that was taking root in this quiet place. Mira watched him, her hand held securely in Reed's, and a sense of peace so deep and complete it felt like a benediction washed over her. She thought of the terrified, half-starved girl who had stumbled onto that train, a creature running from a past she could not escape, and she looked at the woman she was now, standing in the warm afternoon sun, her hand held by a good, quiet man, her future symbolized by the happy, carefree boy playing in a field of resilient flowers. The past was not gone. Its scars would always be a part of her, just as the scars on Reed's body were a part of him. The future was not a guarantee. The world was still a dangerous place, and peace was a fragile, precious thing. But for the first time, the uncertainty did not feel like a threat. It felt like a possibility. It felt like a blank page, waiting to be written. This small, humble ranch was not a promise of a life without hardship, but it was something far more valuable. It was a place to begin again. As the sun began its slow descent, casting a warm, golden light that fell on their shoulders like a gentle hand, the story shifted. The desperate, breathless tale of a girl who ran from the darkness had finally, quietly, come to its end, and in its place, in the warm, hopeful glow of the setting sun, A new story began to unfold. It was the story of a woman who, with her hand held tight in the hand of another, had finally found the courage to stay. Thank you for listening to this story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from today so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and consider supporting it further by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.